The rain poured down in heady sheets, drenching the empty streets as the city slept. Streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the pavement. It was a cold night, the kind that made people hurry home, desperate for warmth. But amidst the silence and the distant hum of passing cars, a small figure sat curled up on the sidewalk, shivering alone. She was just a child, no older than 7, maybe 8, her clothes torn, her tiny hands gripping her knees as she pressed herself against the cold brick wall. Her hair clung to her face, soaked by the rain, and her pale, frightened eyes stared ahead, unseeing. She was blind. People had passed her earlier in the evening, glancing her way, their expressions unreadable. Some whispered, others simply walked on, avoiding the sight of a helpless little girl left to fend for herself. No one stopped. No one asked her name. No one cared. Until he came along. Alexander Grant had spent his life building an empire, one deal, one risk, one decision at a time. He had everything most people could only dream of. Wealth, power, influence. A name that opened doors wherever he went. But none of it mattered on nights like this, when the city revealed its raw, unfiltered reality. He had just left a business dinner, stepping out of his sleek black car, his driver waiting under an umbrella. His mind was occupied, another deal finalized, another success. But something made him stop. A shift in the air, a feeling he couldn't shake. And then he saw her. A small, frail girl, trembling under the weight of the storm. Her lips were turning blue, her breath shallow, but she didn't cry. She just sat there, her blind eyes staring into nothing, as if she had already accepted whatever fate had in store for her. Alexander wasn't the type to get involved. He had learned long ago that the world was a ruthless place, and survival belonged to those who fought for it. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she sat so still, not reaching out, not begging, just existing, as if she had already given up. His footsteps echoed as he approached. The girl flinched as if expecting a blow, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of her dress. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place him in the darkness that was her world. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, Who's there?" Her words hit him harder than he anticipated. She wasn't just abandoned. She was completely alone in every sense of the word. The storm raged on, but in that moment, Alexander made a choice, one that would change both their lives forever. Without another word, he took off his coat, kneeling beside her. He didn't know why he did it, didn't know what compelled him to care. But as he draped the warm fabric over her small shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk away. But taking her in was only the beginning. Because what he didn't know was that this girl carried a past far more complicated than he could have imagined. And in saving her, he might just uncover secrets that would shake his world to its core. Alexander wasn't the kind of man who made impulsive decisions. Every move he made was calculated, measured. Yet that night, as he carried the little girl into his car, something inside him told him this was the right thing to do. The way she clung to his coat, barely speaking, her frail body shivering against the warmth of the leather seats, it was a sight he couldn't forget. "Do you have a name?" he asked gently, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She hesitated. "Emma," she whispered. It was such a small, simple answer, but something about it made his chest tighten. This girl had nothing. No home, no family, no one looking for her. He wanted to ask more, where she came from, how she ended up on that street. But the look on her face told him she was too exhausted, too lost to answer. When they arrived at his estate, Emma's tiny fingers gripped his sleeve as he led her inside. She moved carefully, relying on sound and touch, her bare feet brushing over the soft rugs, the warmth of the grand house wrapping around her like a blanket. The house was massive, far too big for one man, filled with polished floors, towering chandeliers, and expensive furniture that meant little to Alexander. He had built his life on success, yet standing there with Emma, he realized how empty it all felt. The housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, rushed over, confusion in her eyes as she took in the sight of the drenched little girl. "Sir, she's staying here," Alexander said, his tone firm but quiet. "Get her something warm to wear. And food." Mrs. Collins didn't question him, though her expression showed her surprise. It wasn't like him to bring strangers home. But as she led Emma away, Alexander stood there, wondering what exactly he had just gotten himself into. The days turned into weeks, and little by little, Emma adjusted to her new life. She was quiet, always listening, always feeling her way around the house. Alexander noticed how she counted her steps, how she touched the edges of furniture to remember where she was. She never asked for much, never cried, never complained. But the nightmares came. Late at night, Alexander would hear her muffled cries from down the hall. At first, he thought she would grow out of them, but they only got worse. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, he walked into her room. Emma was curled up in her blankets, trembling, whispering something under her breath. He knelt beside her, his voice low. "Emma, it's okay. You're safe." She gasped awake, her blind eyes wide, her breathing ragged. For a moment, she was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere terrifying. Then slowly, she reached out, her small hand touching his arm, as if to make sure he was real. "Don't let them take me," she choked out. Alexander froze. The words cut through him like a knife. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She only gripped his sleeve tighter. That was the first time he realized Emma wasn't just another abandoned child. Someone had left her on that street for a reason. And whoever they were, they had left her with scars far deeper than what was visible. Determined to find answers, Alexander hired private investigators to look into missing children cases. But there was nothing. No record of a blind girl matching Emma's description. No reports, no family looking for her. It was as if she had never existed. But then strange things started happening. One evening, as Alexander returned home from work, he noticed a black car parked across the street. At first, he thought nothing of it. But the next day, it was there again. And the day after that. Then one night, he caught a glimpse of a man standing just outside the gate, watching. Someone was looking for Emma. But why now? And why had they abandoned her in the first place? The realization sent a chill down his spine. He had taken Emma in, given her safety, a home. But was she ever truly safe? Because whoever had left her out in the cold all those years ago, they were coming back for her. Alexander knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The black car, the shadowy figure at his gate, the sense that something was closing in, it wasn't paranoia. Someone was watching, and it had everything to do with Emma. That night, he sat beside her, watching as she carefully felt the edges of the book she was holding. She had learned to read Braille in the past few years, picking up skills with a quiet determination that never ceased to amaze him. She was no longer the fragile little girl he had found on the street. At 17, she had grown into a young woman with a sharp mind, a gentle heart, and a quiet strength that reminded him of someone who had fought her entire life to survive. But the fear was still there, buried deep in the corners of her mind. The past she had never spoken about. The memories she had tried to outrun. "Emma," he said softly, "do you remember anything? From before I found you?" She hesitated. He could tell by the way her fingers stilled over the page. I try not to, she admitted. Then, after a pause, she added, but sometimes in my dreams I hear voices. A woman, a man. They used to argue a lot. Alexander leaned forward. Do you remember their names? She shook her head. No, just that they were scared of something. And then I remember running. Or maybe someone was carrying me. And then everything went dark. Her blindness. He had always assumed she had been born that way. But what if she hadn't? What if something had happened to her? The thought made his stomach tighten. The next day, Alexander's investigator called with a breakthrough. There had been an old case, buried in police reports from a decade ago, a missing girl. The details were vague, almost intentionally hidden. But what caught his attention was the name of the couple involved. A man and a woman who had disappeared shortly after their daughter went missing. Their last name was Warren. Emma Warren. That night, Alexander received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a low, measured voice spoke. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. Who are you? A pause. Then the voice said, we left her for a reason. Rage burned through him. She was a child. You left her in the cold to die. She was safer that way. The voice was calm, almost regretful. But now you've made it easy for them to find her. Them? Before Alexander could say another word, the call ended. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. Alexander doubled security, barely letting Emma out of his sight. She sensed something was wrong, but didn't press him. Maybe she already knew. Then on a quiet evening, it happened. The estate alarms blared through the night. The security team scrambled, voices shouting. Alexander rushed down the hall, his heart hammering. Emma's door was open. She was gone. Outside, headlights cut through the darkness as a black SUV tore down the driveway. Alexander didn't think. He just ran. Jumping into his car, he sped after them, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He had spent 10 years protecting her. He wasn't about to lose her now. The chase led them to the outskirts of the city, down an abandoned road. The SUV screeched to a stop near an old warehouse, and before the tires even settled, Alexander was out of his car, storming toward them. The men were waiting. 2 of them, dressed in black, their faces unreadable. And standing between them, Emma. Her face was pale, but she stood her ground. Alexander could see the way she held her breath, listening, measuring. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. One of the men stepped forward. We don't want trouble, Mr. Grant. Alexander's voice was ice. Then let her go. The man sighed, shaking his head. You don't understand. She was never supposed to be found. Emma's hands curled into fists. Why? She demanded. What did I do? The man hesitated. Then finally, he said, your parents were in trouble. They had enemies. They thought the only way to keep you safe was to make you disappear. Emma's breath caught. They abandoned me. No, the man said. They died trying to protect you. The weight of the truth hit like a tidal wave. For years, Emma had believed she was unwanted, discarded. But now she knew the truth. Her parents had sacrificed everything to keep her hidden. Alexander took a step closer, and now he demanded, why come for her now? The man met his eyes. Because the people who wanted her gone never stopped looking. He hesitated, and now they know she's alive. Silence stretched between them. Then suddenly, the second man pulled out a gun. But he never got the chance to use it. A single gunshot rang through the air, but it wasn't from him. One of Alexander's security men had arrived just in time, taking down the threat before he could act. The first man raised his hands in surrender, his face unreadable. "It's over," Alexander said firmly. "She's staying with me." Emma turned to face him, her unseeing eyes filled with something new, something stronger. For the first time in her life, she knew she wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, Alexander knew what it meant to truly care about someone. They left that night, walking away from the past that had haunted Emma for so long. The truth had finally been revealed, and though the scars of her past would never fully fade, she knew one thing for certain. She had a future, and she had a home, with the man who had once been a stranger but had become her family.